Hello friends! Welcome to our channel, where today we will go into the gloomy, dirty and, frankly, rather smelly Middle Ages. Imagine, you are a medieval murderer. In my head is the image of a cool assassin from Assassin's Creed. The cloak flutters, the dagger glitters, you jump off the roof and disappear into the night. Cool, right? But it's not. The reality was much less romantic. No jumping from towers, no secret gadgets, just rusty knives, fleas, and the constant fear that you will be caught and sent to the gallows. Today we'll look at why being a medieval assassin was the worst job in the world, and take a look at other professions of the time that will make you glad you're living in the 21st century. Executioners, spies, healers with their leeches, no one will stay away. So grab some tea, coffee, or something stronger, get comfortable, and let's dive into this gloomy world. Are you ready? Then let's go, but first, a little disclaimer: if you are waiting for a romanticized story about noble murderers saving the world, then this is not the right video. We're here to tell the truth. Being a murderer in the Middle Ages was dangerous, dirty, and, frankly, sucked. By the end of this video, you'll be thanking your luck that your biggest problem is, well, a dead phone or a queue at a coffee shop. Now let's figure out what made this profession so terrible. When you hear the word assassin, what comes to mind? Most likely, an image from movies or games, a secretive, charismatic hero in a hood who climbs walls, throws daggers accurately and disappears into smoke like a ninja. Thank you, Hollywood, for these fairy tales. Games like Assassin's Creed and movies about medieval heroes created the myth that assassins were the elite of the underground world, masters of stealth and style. You can imagine Ezio Auditore jumping from a tower with the grace of a panther, landing in a haystack and walking off into the sunset after a perfectly completed task. But let's figure out how it really was. Spoiler alert, the reality was much less epic and much more. Well, let's say it's smelly. Let's start from the beginning. The term assassin itself comes from the Arabic word hashishin. It was a real group of Islamic fighters active in the 11th and 13th centuries in Persia and Syria. They were part of the Nizari sect, a Shiite branch of Islam, and were notorious for their political assassinations. Their leader, Hassan I-Sabah, organized a network of agents who eliminated enemies with surgical precision. The Hashashins were masters of secrecy, and they were feared throughout the Middle East. Legends say that they used poisons, daggers, and even psychological pressure to achieve their goals. Some sources claim that they used hashish before missions to enter a state of fearlessness, although historians still debate whether this is true or just a myth invented by their enemies. But here's what's important: the Hashashins are not Europe. In medieval Europe, where our story unfolds, assassins were very different. No secret orders with mystical rituals and secret handshakes. Most often they were mercenaries who were paid for dirty work, or just desperate people who had no other choice. Imagine, you are a poor peasant, you have neither food nor money, and then someone offers a couple of coins to kill some merchant who owes your client. It sounds good, doesn't it? But here's the catch: you have almost no chance of survival. You haven't trained for years in a secret fortress like the Hashashins. You didn't know the secret arts of combat. Most likely, you're just a guy from the street who knows how to hold a knife and is desperate for money. And what about the equipment? Forget about hidden blades, smoke bombs, or cool gadgets from games. Your arsenal is a rusty dagger that you may have stolen from a drunken guard in a tavern. If you're lucky, you have a crossbow, but it most likely breaks every other time because it's made of cheap wood and rusty bolts. A raincoat? Yes, you have it, but it is not made of silk, but of coarse wool, which is infested with fleas. You sleep in this cloak, eat in it, and probably hide in a pile of manure to avoid guards. An escape horse? If you are not the son of a nobleman, then at best you have a skinny mule who would rather die of fatigue than help you escape from the chase. Now about the skills. In the games, assassins are acrobats who jump from towers, do somersaults, and land in a haystack. In real life, the roofs of medieval houses were often thatched, and jumping on them meant either falling through, right onto some peasant's dining table, or breaking your neck. Streets? These are not the clean squares from the movies. These are narrow, dirty alleys littered with garbage, manure, and the contents of chamber pots. Try to run on it without slipping. And if you did get to the target, then the accuracy of your dagger throw depended on how much you drank in the tavern to gain courage. Yes, alcohol was a frequent companion of such professionals, because without it was too scary to climb into the castle with guards. Another myth, that the assassins were part of a cool guild, like in the games. There were almost no such organizations in Europe. There were rumors about secret societies, but they were most likely the invention of chroniclers who loved to dramatize. Most often, the killers worked alone or in small groups that quickly disintegrated due to betrayals. The customers, nobles, merchants, or even priests, were not your friends. They could have hired you and then turned you over to the authorities to cover their tracks. Imagine, you've just completed an order, removed some baron, and then your client decides that it's easier to kill you than to pay. And here you are, covered in mud, with a rusty dagger, running away from his own thugs. Romance? She wasn't there. Just dirt, fear, and constant paranoia. Let's imagine a typical day in the life of a medieval murderer. You receive an order to remove some local baron who owes money to your client. You're sneaking around the city at night, trying not to step in a puddle. Well, you get the idea. Your dagger is blunt because the grindstone was left in the village, and the crossbow jammed at the most inopportune moment. You find the target, but then it turns out that the baron has guards, two healthy guys with swords who, unlike you, ate well and slept well. You try to escape, but you stumble over a basket of fish, and now you are in the hands of the guards. Congratulations, your career is over, and the gallows awaits you. It sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But let's dig deeper into the historical context. The Assassins we mentioned were indeed organized. They had been training for years, had a strict hierarchy, and even used psychological methods to intimidate their enemies. For example, they could leave a dagger on the pillow of a sleeping ruler as a warning, "We can kill you at any moment." There were no such sophisticated methods in Europe. Assassins in Europe were more likely to be loners or temporary mercenaries who were hired for one-time tasks. For example, in 12th century England, mercenaries were sometimes used to eliminate political rivals during wars such as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1154. But these people rarely lived long. One failure, one betrayal, and that's it, the end. Let's give an example. In 1192, Conrad of Montferrat, king of Jerusalem, was assassinated by two assassins, presumably hired by the Assassins or their allies. This was a rare event in Europe, where such organized killings were an exception. Most often, European assassins acted rudely, a dagger in the back in a dark alley, poison in wine, or, if lucky, a crossbow bolt from afar. But even if the task was successful, the reward was not guaranteed. The customer could simply not pay, or even hand you over to the authorities to show how law-abiding he is. And now about everyday life. Medieval cities were not a place for romantic adventures. They were cramped, dirty labyrinths where every other corner hid danger. The guards, though not always competent, might have stumbled upon you by accident. Dogs roaming the streets could smell you and start barking. And the townspeople? They weren't blind. If someone saw you sneaking around with a dagger, the rumors spread faster than the plague. And now you are no longer a hunter, but a prey. Bounty hunters, hired guards, and even ordinary peasants with pitchforks could become your enemies. The equipment also added problems. The daggers blunted quickly, and there was nowhere to sharpen them. Crossbows were expensive, and only rich mercenaries could afford them. Poisons? They were rare and often unreliable. Historical chronicles mention that in the 14th century poisons were sometimes used to eliminate the nobility, but they often did not work or acted too slowly, which gave the victim time to call for help. And what about stealth? A cloak could hide your face, but it didn't make you invisible. If you tried to disappear into the crowd, your smell, a mixture of sweat, dirt, and manure, gave you away. Let's add some humor. Imagine that you are a medieval assassin, and you need to get into the castle. You climb over the wall, but it crumbles because it hasn't been repaired since the time of the Normans. You fall into the moat, which, of course, is full, let's say, organic waste. You get out, covered in mud, and then the guard notices you. You try to throw a dagger, but it gets stuck in the scabbard because you haven't lubricated it in a month. The guard calls for help, and you run, stumbling over baskets of fish and dodging dogs. This is not Assassin's Creed, this is a sitcom, only with a fatal outcome. And here's another detail: there was no Assassin's Code in the Middle Ages. Killer games have rules: don't kill innocent people, act in the name of justice. There was no such thing in real life. You killed the person you paid for, period. Sometimes it was an evil baron, sometimes it was an innocent merchant who just happened to be in the wrong place. The moral? She was a luxury that the assassins couldn't afford. If you refused the order, you were left without money. And without money in the Middle Ages, you were nobody. Let's summarize this chapter. Being a medieval assassin in Europe is not about cool jumps and secret orders. It's about rusty daggers, dirty streets, and constant fear. You weren't a hero, you were an outcast who could be betrayed at any moment. The assassins may have been organized, but European murderers are just people who were trying to survive in a cruel world. And, as we'll see later, survival wasn't the only problem. Let's move on to the risks that made this job a real nightmare. So, we stopped at the fact that being a medieval murderer was deadly. Let's continue to explore why this job was a real nightmare. We have already mentioned that the risk of getting caught was huge. In the Middle Ages, justice did not know half measures. If you were caught with a dagger over the victim's body, you were not sent to a cozy cell with 3 meals a day. No, you were going to be hanged, wheeled, or, in particularly lucky cases, quartered. This is when you were tied to horses and they tore you apart. In 13th century England, for example, murder could be burned at the stake, especially if you were accused of heresy or treason. And if you worked for some powerful lord, he could simply claim that you were acting on your own, and you were executed while he was sipping wine in his castle, discussing what an unreliable mercenary you were. But let's dig deeper into the risks. Competition is another headache. Do you think you're the only killer in town? Oh, no. Medieval towns were teeming with thugs ready to steal your order or turn you over to the guards for a few coppers. Betrayal was the norm. Your partner, with whom you shared bread in the tavern yesterday, could sell you to the authorities if he was offered more. And the customers? They were even worse. Imagine, you risk your life, make your way through the sewers to remove the target, and in the end, instead of gold, you get the promise of pay tomorrow. Or, even more hilariously, the customer decides that it's easier to kill you than to pay. And here you are, covered in mud, with a rusty dagger, running away from his own thugs. Sounds like a great career path, right? Now about the everyday difficulties. Medieval cities are not romantic movie sets. These are labyrinths of narrow, dirty streets littered with garbage, manure, and the contents of chamber pots. Making your way down the alley? Congratulations, you just stepped into a puddle that is clearly not made of water. Hiding in a barrel to escape the guards? Now you smell like fish, rotten cabbage, and something better not to think about. Are you trying to climb onto the roof for a dramatic escape? Half of the medieval houses were made of clay and straw, so good luck not falling straight into the bedroom of some peasant, who, by the way, may be armed with a pitchfork. What if you missed? Let's say you threw a dagger, but hit the wall instead of the target. Or your crossbow, which you bought from a dubious dealer, jammed at the crucial moment. Now you are not only without money, but also with a bunch of enemies who know your face. And don't think that you can just walk off into the sunset. Medieval cities were small, and rumors spread faster than the plague. One failure, and you became a target for guards, bounty hunters, and even other assassins who saw you as a competitor. Health is another huge problem. The Middle Ages was a time when an ordinary scratch could send you to the other world due to infection. There were no antibiotics, and the healers, if they could be called that at all, offered either prayers or bloodletting, which often only worsened the situation. If you were wounded in battle, say, a guard grazed you with a sword, you either recovered on your own or died in a ditch. And even if you escaped injury, constant stress, malnutrition, and a life on the run were destroying your body. The average life expectancy in those days was about 30 to 40 years, and for a murderer it was even less. Imagine, you risk everything for a couple of coins, and in the end you die of infection because you cut yourself with your own rusty dagger. Not exactly the kind of fame you dreamed of, right? And here's another detail: in the Middle Ages, there was no murderers' union. No sick days, no pensions, no days off. If you were injured, no one came with a basket of fruits and wishes for a speedy recovery. You either found a way to survive, or you became just another unmarked grave. And if you miraculously lived to old age, which was rare, you were going to live the life of an outcast beggar. No one wanted to deal with a man who had spent his whole life killing for money. Even in a tavern, you could be refused a mug of ale if someone found out who you were. Let's summarize the risks. You work alone, without support, with a constant risk of betrayal. Your weapons are unreliable, your customers are liars, and the city is a minefield of mud, guards, and traitors. And if you are caught, you will face not just death, but a long and painful execution. For example, in 14th century France, murder could be boiled in boiling oil or sewn into a bag of vipers and thrown into the river. Sounds like a great career ending, doesn't it? And we haven't talked about how society treated murderers yet. Let's get to that. Now let's talk about how society saw murderers and why this profession made you an outcast. In the Middle Ages, murderers were not folk heroes like Robin Hood from legends. Even if you took out some greedy baron who was robbing the peasants, people didn't give you a standing ovation. Murder was considered a grave sin, and the church did not hesitate to remind you that hell awaits you. If you were caught, you weren't just executed, you were publicly humiliated, cursed, and exiled from society. But even if you escaped punishment, your life was not sweet. The neighbors shied away from you like you were a leper. In the tavern, you couldn't relax. Suddenly there was a spy or a bounty hunter sitting at the next table, ready to turn you in for a couple of coins. The killer's life was lonely. No friends, no parties. Family? Forget it. Who wants to get involved with a man who might not come home because his client decided it was cheaper to kill you than to pay? Even if you found someone who was willing to communicate with you, it was most likely another criminal who couldn't be trusted. Imagine, you're sitting in a tavern, trying to drink ale, and everyone around you is whispering, squinting at you and waiting for you to do something suspicious. Paranoia was your constant companion. The church played a huge role in this. Murder was not just a crime, but a sin against God. The priests could refuse you absolution, which meant that you were doomed to eternal torment in hell. At least, that's what they thought at the time. Even if you worked for a good cause, for example, you removed a tyrant who oppressed the people, the church and society stigmatized you anyway. Historical example: the assassination of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170 in England. The 4 knights who killed him thought they were doing the will of King Henry II. They were counting on a reward, maybe even titles and lands. But what did they get? Curses of the church, exile, and outcast status. The king disowned them, and the people cursed them. The moral? Even if you did dirty work for those in power, you could still be thrown under the bus. But let's look at it from the other side. Let's say you're a successful killer. You've completed dozens of orders, earned some gold, and even escaped the guards. What's next? You can't just retire and open a tavern. Your reputation precedes you. People know what you do, and no one wants to deal with you. In the Middle Ages, rumors spread quickly, especially in small towns. If someone saw you sneaking down an alley with a dagger, or heard that you were connected with the murder of some merchant, your life in this city was over. You could have been kicked out, or in the worst case, lynched without trial. And here's another detail: there was no assassins' union in the Middle Ages. No sick days, no pensions, no days off. If you were injured, say, you were stabbed by a guard, no one brought you a basket of fruit and wished you a speedy recovery. You either found a way to survive, or you became just another unmarked grave. And if you lived to old age, which was rare, you were going to live the life of a beggar. No one wanted to hire a man who had spent his whole life killing for money. Even in a tavern, you could be refused a mug of ale if someone found out who you were. Society in the Middle Ages was built on fear and religion. Murderers, even if they worked for the right side, were considered violators of the divine order. In the eyes of the church and the people, you were not just a criminal, but a man who challenged God himself. And it made your life even more isolated. You couldn't go to confession and hope for forgiveness, the priest would most likely send you straight to the executioner. You couldn't join the community because no one trusted you. Even if you tried to get over the past, your past followed you like a shadow. Let's give you another example. In 1307, King Philip IV of France decided to destroy the Templar order, accusing them of heresy and other crimes. Many of those who participated in the arrests and executions of the Templars were mercenaries or assassins hired by the king. But after the deed was done, the king did not reward them, but simply removed them to cover their tracks. These people risked everything to carry out his orders, but ended up victims of the same system they worked for. It was a classic medieval scenario: you do the dirty work, and then they throw you away like a used rag. Now let's move on to the more section. Being a murderer was terrible, but don't think it was the only lousy job in the Middle Ages. Let's look at other professions that were no better, and sometimes worse. Let's start with the executioners. At first glance, it seems that this is a stable job. Executions were a regular event, and an executioner was always needed. But here's the catch: the executioners were the pariahs of society. They were feared and despised. They lived outside the city, often in separate houses, so as not to infect others with their presence. No one wanted to be friends with the executioner, marry his daughter, or even sit at the same table with him. The work of the executioner was not only dirty in the moral sense, but also in the literal sense. The executions were bloody. Beheading, hanging, and charioteering all left behind pools of blood, chunks of flesh, and other unpleasant things. And who do you think cleaned it? That's right, the executioner himself. He also had to repair his tools, axes, ropes, torture wheels. And if the execution was unsuccessful, for example, the axe was blunt, and the head did not fly off with the first blow, the crowd blamed the executioner. There have been cases when an angry mob lynched an executioner for bad work. Can you imagine? You try, you do your job, and in the end you get beaten for blunting the axe, but at least the executioners had an official status. But the spies? Their work was even more risky. Spies in the Middle Ages often worked undercover, posing as merchants, pilgrims, or even priests. If they were discovered, they would suffer a painful death, often slow and demonstrative, so that others would not be offended. For example, in the 15th century, during the 100 Years' War between Britain and France, spies were caught and burned at the stake or drowned in a river. And even if you successfully completed the mission, the payment depended on the result. Didn't you bring valuable information? Then no gold. And spies had to live in constant paranoia. Every person you talked to could be an enemy. Every glance in the tavern could mean that you were discovered. Let's give an example. During the Wars of Scottish Independence in the 13th and 14th centuries, spies were often used to gather information about the movements of British troops. But if a Scottish spy was caught, he wasn't just killed, he was publicly tortured to get information about his allies. And even if the spy returned with valuable data, he could be accused of betrayal if something went wrong. Life as a spy was stressful, you couldn't trust anyone, not even your customers. Now about the healers. It sounds like a noble profession, doesn't it? Save lives, treat the sick. But in the Middle Ages, medicine was more like a lottery with bad odds. The healers used methods that today seem wild: bloodletting, leeches, ointments of herbs mixed with, well, let's say, questionable ingredients. If a patient died, and this happened often, the blame was placed on the doctor. In some cities, unsuccessful doctors could be exiled or even executed for witchcraft. And the doctors were constantly in contact with the sick, which meant a high risk of contracting plague, leprosy, or other deadly diseases. There were no antiseptics, no masks, and no gloves. If you treated a person with the plague, you could be the next victim. And here's what's interesting: all these professions, murderers, executioners, spies, healers, had something in common. They were dangerous, poorly paid, and made you an outcast. The executioners lived outside the city, the spies lived in constant fear, and the healers lived under threat of accusations of witchcraft. And the killers? They combined all the worst: risk, loneliness, and lack of any protection. Compared to them, even working in a modern call center seems like a dream. At least they won't put you in a bag of vipers for a bad day. Now let's talk about how criminals were caught in the Middle Ages, including our unfortunate murderers. You might think that there was no criminology in those days, but that's not quite true. Of course, fingerprints and DNA analysis did not exist, but medieval authorities had their own methods, and they did. Let's just say they're quite creative. And violent. If you were a murderer, then the chance of being caught wasn't that small, especially if you weren't a master of stealth. The first and main method of capture is denunciations. In the Middle Ages, people loved to rat on each other. Did the neighbor see you sneaking down the alley with a dagger? He could have snitched on you for a few coins or just out of fear. Has the innkeeper noticed that you're asking strange questions about the local baron? He's already running towards the guards. Even your friends, if you can call them that at all, could turn you in if they were offered a reward. In the 13th century, there was a hue and cry system in England. If anyone noticed a crime, they had to raise the alarm, and all the men in the area were required to join the chase. Imagine, you've just stabbed a target and are trying to escape, but a whole crowd is chasing you with pitchforks and torches. It's not exactly a scene from Assassin's Creed, is it? Interrogations were also part of criminology, and they weren't for the faint of heart. If you were suspected of murder, you could be tortured to extract a confession. Red hot tongs, a rack, and water poured down the throat were standard methods. For example, in 14th century France, murder suspects could be waterboarded. You were tied up and thrown into a river. If you were drowning, you were innocent, hooray, but it's too late. If they surfaced, they were guilty, and a bonfire was waiting for you. The logic is ironclad, don't you think? The punishments were even more terrible. Murder, especially political murder, was considered a grave crime, and the authorities liked to make executions demonstrative. Hanging was the easiest option. But if they really wanted to punish you, they could wheel you around, break the bones on the wheel until you die. Or quartered, torn apart by horses. In some cases, murderers were burned alive, especially if they were accused of heresy or witchcraft. For example, in 1307, when the Templar order was being destroyed in France, many were executed for alleged crimes, including murder. It didn't matter if they were guilty, the main thing was that it looked intimidating to the crowd. Historical example, in 1381, during the peasant uprising in England, many murders were committed in the chaos of the riot. When the authorities regained control, they began mass arrests. Suspects were caught on the basis of denunciations and testimony from neighbors. Those found guilty were hanged or beheaded without much trial. This shows how medieval justice worked: fast, brutal, and often without proof, but there were also more sophisticated methods. In some cities, a trial by fire was used. The suspect was given a red-hot iron to hold, and if the wound healed cleanly, he was considered innocent. Of course, in reality, wounds almost always festered, so this method was more of a way to guarantee punishment. And then there were the juries, which consisted of local residents. But they often made verdicts based on rumors or personal animosity. If you were a stranger in the city, your chances of being acquitted were close to zero. For the assassins, this meant that stealth was their only chance. But even if you were a master of disguise, accidents could give you away. For example, in 12th century Germany, a mercenary was caught because his cloak got caught on a fence while he was trying to escape. It sounds like a comedy, but for him it ended with the gallows. And there were bounty hunters, professional hunters of criminals who worked for rewards. They could track you down by footsteps, rumors, or even by the smell of your raincoat, which, we remind you, did not smell like roses. Now let's move away from blood and executions and talk about how ordinary people lived in the Middle Ages and how these conditions made the job of a murderer even worse. You might have thought that sneaking through dark alleys with a dagger was bad enough, but add to that dirt, disease, and constant hunger, and you'll understand why the killer's life was a real nightmare. Medieval towns and villages were not a place for romantic adventures, but a harsh test of survival. Life in cities, filth and chaos. Medieval cities are not the picturesque scenery that you see in movies. They were cramped, dirty labyrinths, where the streets were covered with a layer of manure, garbage, and the contents of chamber pots. In 14th century London, for example, the streets were so narrow that two people could hardly walk apart without stepping on each other's feet. Now imagine that you are a killer who is trying to get to the target unnoticed. You're sneaking down the alley, trying not to step in a puddle. Well, you get the idea. Your cape clings to a basket of fish, and the local dog starts barking, attracting the attention of the guards. It's not a mission, it's a disaster. A hygiene? Forget it. In the Middle Ages, the shower was a luxury available only to the rich. Ordinary people, including murderers, washed once a month if they were lucky. That meant you smelled like you could be smelled from a mile away. It was a problem for the killer. How do you stay invisible if your scent has given you away? And there were fleas, lice, and rats everywhere. Your cloak, which you wore day and night, became home to an entire ecosystem of parasites. And if you thought it was just an inconvenience, think again. Fleas carried the plague, and lice carried typhus. One flea that bit you could send you to the other world faster than the guards of food. Hunger or poison. Food in the Middle Ages was also a challenge. If you were a poor mercenary, your diet consisted of stale bread, thin soup, and, if you were lucky, a piece of cheese that smelled no better than your cloak. Meat was a rarity, and fruits and vegetables were a luxury. Hunger was a constant companion, and this made the job of the killer even more difficult. Imagine, you haven't eaten for 2 days, you feel dizzy, and you need to get into the castle and remove the target. Your hands are shaking, you can barely hold the dagger, and then you hear your stomach growling loudly. Stealth? Not this time, and the food could be dangerous. The water was often polluted, and many drank ale or wine to avoid infection. But the ale was weak and the wine was expensive, so the killers often drank what they could find. Spoiled food was common, and poisoning was as common as a cold. In the 13th century, there were cases in Europe when entire villages died out due to bread baked from contaminated rye, which caused hallucinations and death. For a murderer who was already living on the edge, it was another risk. Clothing and housing. Cold and damp clothing in the Middle Ages was rough and uncomfortable. Your cloak, which you considered your assassin attribute, was made of wool or linen and quickly wore out. You were freezing in winter because the poor didn't have proper warm clothes. In the summer, you sweated, and your raincoat became a breeding ground for bacteria. Shoes? If you had boots instead of wooden sandals, you were already considered lucky. But even boots quickly wore out on muddy roads, and you could be left barefoot in the middle of a mission. Housing didn't add to the joy either. If you were a mercenary, you most likely did not have a permanent home. You spent the night in taverns, barns, or just outdoors. In the cities, housing was cramped and dirty. In 14th century Paris, many poor people lived in shacks where the roof leaked and the walls were made of clay. For an assassin, this meant that you didn't have a safe place to hide after the mission. If you were wanted, you couldn't just go home and relax. Your house is a street, and the street is a minefield. And now let's move away from the grim reality and see how the image of a medieval murderer turned into what we see in modern games and movies. Assassin's Creed, Hitman, and even ninja movies have all created a romanticized image of a killer, secretive, stylish, with an arsenal of cool gadgets and a code of honor. But, as we have already found out, the reality was far from that. Let's look at how pop culture has distorted the image of the killer, and why these myths are so far from the truth. Assassin's Creed, the romance that never existed. Let's start with the most famous example, the Assassin's Creed series of games. These games have made the assassins a pop culture icon. Ezio Auditore, Altair, Connor, these guys jump from towers, use hidden blades, fight the Templars and save the world. Their cloaks are always clean, their weapons are a work of art, and their skills are simply superhuman. But let's compare it with reality. In Assassin's Creed, assassins are members of a secret order that fights for freedom and justice. They have been training for years, have access to cutting-edge technology, by the standards of their time, and follow a strict code. There was nothing like this in real life. As we said in the first part, European assassins were mostly mercenaries who worked for money, not for ideals. There were no secret orders in Europe. This is a myth, perhaps inspired by the Hashashins, but greatly exaggerated. The Hashashins, we recall, were an organized group in Persia and Syria, but their European colleagues were singles or temporary groups that broke up due to betrayals. Hidden blades? In games, it's a cool gadget that slides out of your sleeve and allows you to kill instantly. In reality, there was nothing like that. Daggers were the simplest weapons, and they often broke or blunted. Smoke bombs? Forget it. If you wanted to create smoke, you would have to set something on fire, risking attracting attention. Jumping from towers into a haystack? As we have already said, thatched roofs often collapsed, and there were no haystacks on the streets. Instead, there were piles of manure, and jumping into them was not the best idea. A historical example, in Assassin's Creed 2, Ezio uses a hidden blade designed by Leonardo da Vinci. It's cool, but in real life, Leonardo, although he was a brilliant inventor, did not make weapons for mercenaries. His inventions, like the tank or the parachute, were more concepts than actual devices. And mercenaries in 15th century Italy used simple daggers for crossbows, which often broke. No gadgets, just sweat and blood. Movies and TV series, killers as superheroes. Films have also contributed to the mythologization. Take, for example, the 1995 movie Assassins starring Antonio Banderas or the TV series Legend of the Seeker, where all sorts of mysterious killers appear. In these stories, murderers are charismatic, almost invulnerable heroes who are always one step ahead of their enemies. They use poisons, throwing knives, and, of course, they look like they just came out of a beauty salon. The reality? You already know, dirty raincoats, rusty daggers, and a smell that scared even dogs away. In films, murderers often work for a good cause, saving the world, overthrowing tyrants, protecting the weak. There was almost no such thing in the Middle Ages. The killers worked for money, and their goals were often far from noble. For example, in the 12th century in England, mercenaries sometimes killed merchants or minor nobles on behalf of their competitors. No justice, just business. And if you refused the order, you were left without money, which means without food and shelter. Another feature of the films is the epic battles. In real life, the killers avoided open combat. If you were surrounded by guards, you were most likely running away rather than engaging in a fight like in a blockbuster movie. Why? Because the guards were better armed, well-fed and trained. And you? You were a hungry mercenary with a blunt dagger who hadn't slept in 3 days. You had no chance of winning in the style of a Hollywood hero. Now let's get back to reality from myths and look at the real stories of medieval murderers. These stories are a mix of tragedies, failures, and rare successes that show how far the killer's life was from Hollywood fantasies. We will analyze several well-known cases, as well as a couple of curious failures, so that you understand why being a murderer was not only dangerous, but sometimes funny. The murder of Thomas Becket, dirty work for the king. One of the most famous cases is the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170 in England. It was a classic example where murderers thought they were doing the right thing but ended up paying the price. Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury and clashed with King Henry II over the power of the church. Henry, in a fit of anger, allegedly said, "Who will rid me of this annoying priest?" The four knights took this as an order and went to Canterbury Cathedral, where they stabbed Becket right at the altar. Sounds like a success, right? But here's what happened next. Instead of rewards, the knights became outcasts. The church declared them cursed, and the people, heroes of the faith, made Becket a saint. Henry disowned the assassins, saying it was their initiative. The knights fled, but their lives were ruined, they were despised, their lands were confiscated, and they died in exile. The moral? Even if you were doing the king's bidding, you could be thrown under a bus to keep it clean. It was a lesson for the killers. Trusting the customer is a bad idea. Failures and curiosities. When things don't go according to plan, not all the murders were so dramatic. Sometimes they ended in complete fiasco, and it's almost comical. Let's take a case from the 13th century in Italy. One mercenary was hired to take out a wealthy merchant in Venice. He made his way into the house, but instead of the merchant, he stabbed his servant, who was sleeping in the master's bed. A mistake? Some more. The merchant raised the alarm, and the mercenary was caught when he tried to escape through the window, but got stuck in it. He was hanged, and the story became a local legend. Can you imagine the headline, "Would-be murderer stuck in window," and became a laughingstock? Another example is from the 14th century in France. The mercenary received an order to remove the local baron. He decided to use the poison he bought from a dubious alchemist. The poison turned out to be weak, and the baron, instead of dying, just spent the day in the bathroom. The mercenary, deciding that the job was done, came to collect the payment, but was caught by the baron's guards, who, although weakened, was very angry. The result? The mercenary was being wheeled, and the baron wrote a saga about it so that everyone would know how tenacious he was. These failures show how unpredictable the killer's job was. Weapons were broken, plans were ruined, and customers were often deceived. In 12th century Germany, a murderer was caught because his crossbow bolt was stuck in a wall instead of a target. He tried to escape, but his raincoat got caught on the fence, and the guards found him dangling like laundry in the wind. Such stories were not uncommon, and they show that the killer's life was not only dangerous, but also full of ridiculous situations. So, we've come a long way through the dirty streets of the Middle Ages, rusty daggers, and failed assassination attempts. We found out why being a medieval murderer was the worst job in the world, compared their lives with other professions like executioners and spies, and debunked the myths of pop culture. Now it's time to take stock and answer the main question: why was this profession so lame, and what can we learn from it? Spoiler alert, if you think your job is hell, think again. At least you're not forced to hide in a pile of manure to avoid guards. Why was it so terrible? Let's summarize. Being a medieval assassin sucked for several reasons. First, the risk. Every order was a game of death. You could have been caught, betrayed, executed, or simply killed unnecessarily. The guards, bounty hunters, and informers were all against you. Secondly, the conditions. Dirty streets, lack of hygiene, hunger, and disease made your life unbearable. Your cloak was a home for fleas, your dagger was rusting, and the food, if you had any, could poison you. Thirdly, loneliness. You were an outcast whom you feared and hated. Friends? Family? Forget it. Even your customers could turn you in to cover their tracks. Compare this with other professions. The executioners were despised, but at least they had stable jobs. Spies lived in paranoia, but sometimes they could count on the protection of influential patrons. The doctors risked getting infected, but at least they weren't hanged for every mistake. The killers? They combined the worst of all worlds: risk, filth, loneliness, and a complete lack of respect. Even if you were the best at what you did, one wrong step and you're on the gallows, in a ditch, or in a bag of vipers. Lessons for us. What can we learn from this story? First, be grateful that you live in the 21st century. Your problems, a queue at a coffee shop, a dead phone, or a deadline at work, are nothing compared to what medieval murderers went through. Don't you believe it? Try to get through the sewers without antibiotics and with a rusty dagger, and then we'll talk. Secondly, this story reminds us that romance is often an illusion. Movies and games like Assassin's Creed make us dream of adventure, but reality has always been harsher. And third, appreciate your team. The killers were alone, and that made them vulnerable. In today's world, you have friends, colleagues, and family. Don't forget how important this is. A historical example for the finale. In the 15th century in Italy, during the wars between city-states, mercenaries were often used for political assassinations. But even the most successful of them, like those who worked for the Medici family, rarely lived to old age. They were either killed by competitors or betrayed by their customers. This shows that there was no happy ending for murderers in the Middle Ages. The best outcome? You made some money and disappeared until you were found. A call to action. And so we have come to the end of our gloomy but hopefully fascinating walk through the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this trip, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the bell. Do you want more stories about strange professions or failures of the past? Write in the comments, and we'll figure out why being a medieval dentist or sewer cleaner was no less lame. In the meantime, be grateful that you're not sneaking through dirty alleys with a rusty dagger. Now that we've summed it up, let's add some context and dig deeper into the Middle Ages. What else made the killer's life so difficult? How did technology, weapons, and everyday realities affect their work? And how does it all compare to modern times? This chapter is a bonus for those who want more facts, more humor, and a few parallels to our lives. Let's go. Technology and weapons. Not so cool. You might think that medieval murderers used at least decent weapons, since they risked their lives. But no, the technology of that time was, to put it mildly, not up to par. Daggers, the killer's main weapon, were often made of low-quality iron that quickly rusted. Sharpening them was a problem, because not everyone had grindstones, and blacksmiths were expensive. Crossbows? They were cool, but expensive and unreliable. In the 14th century, a crossbow could cost more than a peasant's annual salary, and it reloaded so slowly that if you missed, you became an easy target. Poisons are another myth. In the movies, murderers use sophisticated poisons that kill instantly. In reality, poisons were rare and often unreliable. In the 13th century, arsenic or plant poisons like belladonna were used in Europe, but they either acted too slowly or did not act at all. Historical example: in 1378, in Italy, a mercenary tried to poison a cardinal by mixing poison into his wine. The cardinal survived because the poison was diluted, and the mercenary was caught bragging in a tavern. The result? He was hanged, and the cardinal wrote about it in his memoirs, laughing at the loser. Other technologies were not impressive either. Smoke bombs? They didn't exist. If you wanted to create smoke, you would have to set fire to straw or rags, which would most likely attract more attention than distract. Hidden blades? This is a fantasy inspired, perhaps, by stories about the Hashashins, but there was nothing like it in Europe. Your best weapon is your mind and running skills. But even this didn't always save you if you stumbled over a pile of trash or your raincoat clung to the fence. Daily life. The struggle for survival. Everyday life in the Middle Ages was harsh not only for murderers, but for everyone. The food was scarce, and even if you had money, it was difficult to buy something decent. In cities, markets often sold spoiled food, and the water was polluted. In the 14th century in London, for example, the Thames was more of a sewer than a source of water. For the killer, this meant that you either drank ale to avoid infection or risked dysentery. And the ale, by the way, was weak and sour, not what you imagine when you think of beer. Clothes were also a problem. Your cloak, which you considered your assassin attribute, was rough, heavy, and wore out quickly. In the 13th century, woolen cloaks were the standard for the poor, and they were infested with fleas. Shoes? If you had boots instead of wooden sandals, you were already lucky. But the boots wore out in a couple of months, especially if you were running on dirty streets. For the killer, this meant that you either spent money on new clothes or walked around in rags, which made you even more noticeable. Housing, as we said, was either non-existent or shacks. In 15th century Paris, the poor lived in houses where the walls were made of clay and the roofs leaked. For the killer, this meant that you didn't have a safe place to rest. If you were wanted, you couldn't just hide at home, you were found by rumors or denunciations. And the taverns where you were looking for orders were a trap, one drunken guard or a curious tavern keeper, and you were already in chains. Comparisons with modernity. Now let's compare it with our lives. Imagine that you are a modern freelancer working from home. You have a laptop, Wi-Fi, food delivery, and a comfortable bed. The medieval assassin didn't have any of that. Instead of a laptop, there's a rusty dagger. Instead of Wi-Fi, there are rumors in the tavern. Instead of delivering food, there is stale bread in the hope that it is not poisoned. And instead of a bed, there's a pile of straw with fleas. If your freelance project fails, you lose money. If the killer's order failed, he lost his life. Another comparison, modern technology. Today we have GPS, cameras, drones, everything that makes stealth difficult, but also helps in the work. In the Middle Ages, the only technology was your legs and the ability to hide. If you were wrong, you were caught. If you got tired, they caught up with you. And no mission planning apps, just your brain and maybe a map drawn on a piece of skin, which was most likely inaccurate. Historical example, in 14th century Germany, mercenaries sometimes used city maps to plan assassination attempts. But these maps were primitive, often without scale, and could lead you to a dead end. One mercenary in Nuremberg was caught because his map indicated the wrong alley, and he went straight to the guards. Today, you would just open Google Maps and avoid this mistake. But then? Good luck! We walked a long way through the dirty alleys of the Middle Ages, rusty daggers, flea cloaks, and ridiculous sinkholes. We found out why being a murderer was the worst job in the world, compared their lives with other professions, debunked pop culture myths, and delved into historical chronicles. Now it's time to put an end to our epic saga. In this part, we will summarize the final results, add a couple of funny stories, draw the last parallels with modern times, and energize you for your next adventure. Let's go. Religion. The church is the main boss. In the last part, we started talking about how religion in the Middle Ages was not just a spiritual part of life, but a real control machine. The church was everywhere, from sermons in cathedrals to spies who spied on sinners. For the murderer, this meant that you were not just a criminal, but an enemy of God. Murder was considered a grave sin, and the church did not hesitate to remind about it. In the 13th century in England, priests could declare you a heretic or cursed if you were suspected of murder. It meant not only hanging, but eternal torment in hell. At least, that's what you were promised. Can you imagine the stress? Not only are you hiding from the guards, but you're also wondering if the devil will roast you after you die. The church also organized a witch hunt, which in the Middle Ages was not only about witches. If you were accused of using poison, and poison was considered a diabolical weapon, you could be burned at the stake without any questions. Historical example: in 1324, in France, a woman who was suspected of poisoning a local baron was burned as a witch, although there was no evidence. Her accomplice, a mercenary who might just have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, shared her fate. For the killer, this meant that even without direct evidence, you could become a target of religious fanaticism. Comparison with modernity? Today, the church doesn't dictate how we live, well, almost, and you don't risk being burned for looking suspiciously. But imagine if your boss could send you to hell for being late for work. That's about how a medieval killer felt, except instead of a boss, there was a church, and instead of a reprimand, there was a bonfire. Be grateful that your problems are solved with conversation, not with red-hot tones. Communications. Rumors are faster than the internet. Communications in the Middle Ages were primitive, but incredibly effective when it came to rumors. No phones, internet, or even normal mail, just messengers, taverns, and gossip. If you were a murderer, it worked against you. In small towns, rumors spread faster than the plague. Did the neighbors see you sneaking around with a dagger? By morning, the whole city knew that you were a suspicious character. Has the innkeeper noticed that you are asking strange questions? He's already whispering about it to the guards for a few coins to eye. In the 14th century in Germany, for example, a mercenary was caught because a local laundress noticed blood on his cloak. She told about it at the market, and a couple of hours later the guards were already knocking on his door. It wasn't Sherlock Holmes, it was just the power of gossip. For an assassin, this meant that stealth was almost impossible. Even if you were a master of disguise, one chatty old lady could send you to the gallows. Emails were also a problem. If you received an order, it was often transmitted verbally or through a note that could be intercepted by anyone. In the 15th century in Italy, a mercenary was caught because his client sent a letter with the details of the assassination attempt, but the messenger was intercepted. The letter was read out at the trial, and the mercenary went to be executed. No encryption, no VPN, just the hope that your messenger won't get caught. Comparison with modernity? Today we have encrypted chats, anonymous messengers, and the ability to delete correspondence with one click. In the Middle Ages, your only way to remove evidence was to burn a note, but even then the ashes could be found. And the rumors? They were like modern social networks, only without likes and with a real threat to life. So the next time you get annoyed by spam and messengers, think about the guy who was hanged because of a chatty tavern keeper. The legal system, justice or chaos. The medieval legal system was far from what we call justice. The laws depended on the city, the lord, or the mood of the judge. For the murderer, this meant that you could be executed without evidence, simply because you looked guilty. In the 13th century, there was a hue and cry system in England, where anyone who noticed a crime could raise the alarm, and all the men in the area had to chase after you. Imagine, you've just taken out a target, and a crowd is running after you with pitchforks, torches, and a pair of vicious dogs. This is not an action movie chase, but a scene from a nightmare. The interrogations were even worse. Tortures, red-hot forceps, a rack, pouring water down the throat were standard procedure. In 14th century France, murder suspects could be subjected to a water trial. You were thrown into a river, and if you drowned, you were innocent. Hooray, but too late. If they surfaced, they were guilty, and a bonfire was waiting for you. Logic? She wasn't there. It was a way to ensure punishment, not to find the truth. The punishments were theatrically brutal. Hanging is another easy option. Wheeling, quartering, burning, all this was used to scare the crowd. In the 15th century in Italy, a mercenary caught attempting to assassinate a nobleman was torn apart by horses in the town square. The crowd applauded, and his client, of course, disowned him. For a murderer, this meant that even success did not guarantee safety. You could be betrayed or executed for intimidation. Comparison with modernity? Today we have lawyers, courts, and the presumption of innocence. If you are accused, you have a chance to defend yourself. In the Middle Ages, your only chance is to escape or hope that the judge is in a good mood. No wonder the killers tried to be inconspicuous. Any mistake, and you became the star of a public execution. Historical anecdote: the failure in Venice. Let's dilute the gloom with a funny story. In the 14th century in Venice, a mercenary was ordered to kill a rich merchant. He decided to act stylishly, sneak through the canals on a boat, climb into the house through the window and kill the target. The plan sounded like a scene from a movie, but reality, as always, let me down. First of all, the boat turned out to be old and leaked, so he got home wet and frozen. Secondly, the window was shuttered, and he spent half an hour trying to open them until he woke up the dog. The dog barked, the guards came running, and the mercenary, trying to escape, fell into the canal. They fished him out, wet and miserable, with a dagger in his hand. The result? The execution, and the story became a local legend. The Venetians were still joking. Do you want to be a murderer? Learn to swim first. This case shows how medieval conditions, from leaky boats to vigilant dogs, turned even an ingenious plan into a comedy of errors. Being a murderer was not only dangerous, but also humiliating. One wrong step, and you became a laughingstock, not a legend. Final lessons: what have we learned from this saga? First, be grateful for modernity. Your problems, traffic jams, bad Wi-Fi, or burnt toast, are nothing compared to a life where you could be hanged for a dirty raincoat. Medieval murderers fought hunger, fleas, rusty weapons, and betrayal, all for a few coins that might not even be enough for bread. Today we have hot water, antibiotics, and food delivery. This is already a victory. Secondly, don't believe the myths. Pop culture like Assassin's Creed or Game of Thrones paints assassins as stylish heroes with daggers and a code of honor. But the reality was dirty, bloody, and full of failures. These myths are inspiring, but they are far from the truth. The next time you jump from a tower in the game, remember that in real life you would have landed in a pile of manure, not in a haystack. Third, appreciate the support. The killers were lone wolves, and that made them vulnerable. No one watched their backs, no one helped them in difficult times. Today we have friends, family, colleagues. This is a huge resource. Even if your boss is a tyrant and your neighbor steals your Wi-Fi, you are not alone. Call a friend, chat, like this video, and feel how cool it is to be part of a team. The last historical example. Let's end with a story that perfectly sums up our topic. In 15th century Italy, during the wars between Florence and Milan, a mercenary named Giovanni was hired to assassinate a Florentine diplomat. He planned everything perfectly: to sneak into the house, stab the target, and escape through the backyard. But, as always, reality intervened. His dagger broke during the attack, the diplomat screamed, and Giovanni, trying to escape, got stuck in the fence. The guards caught him while he was cursing at his cloak, which had caught on a nail. He was executed, and the diplomat wrote about it in his memoirs, adding, "Never hire an assassin who can't run." This story is the quintessence of the life of a medieval murderer: risks, failures, and a complete lack of fame. Giovanni did not become a hero like Ezio Auditore, but became an anecdote. And this is perhaps the best lesson: in the Middle Ages, even the most ambitious plans could be ruined by a rusty dagger or a curious dog. A call to action. This is the end of our gloomy, but hopefully fascinating walk through the Middle Ages. We figured out why being a murderer sucked, laughed at their failures, and learned how dirt, fleas, and betrayal made their lives unbearable. If you enjoyed this trip, please like, subscribe, and click on the bell. Do you want more stories about strange professions or ridiculous moments of the past? Write in the comments. Maybe let's look at how medieval chefs poisoned kings by accident, or why being a buffoon was more dangerous than it seems. The choice is yours. In the meantime, Be grateful that you live in a world with hot water, without rusty daggers and fleas. See you in the next video, and don't forget to check if there are guards around the corner.